Yeah, so that's why I wonder if like Oklahoma has a culture of exercise, but a poor culture of eating contributes to the obesity, right? So I think like that's one of those things where it's probably very interesting. It's like, are they just fitter now because they are more like stereotypically fit and they can get on the list because they're not so fat, or what? Yeah, like what else is going on? Because it sounded like he was like active but also obese, and you can do that, right?
Right.
That happens. So I think that's one of those interesting intersections that he just doesn't talk about. Like you need the details to understand what else is going on.
Yeah. I think there's also something to be said about how maybe, and we're going to take his word for it, right? But
Can we connect our second phone as well?
yeah, sure.
You need cable?
No, I brought one.
Terrific. Okay. Now the other machine is going to need a cable to lightning start.
Do you have an extension cord?
I have two of them.
Yeah, I only need the one.
It's hard for us to connect. You don't want to leave out most of the audience to hear the important things that you're saying. They think we can connect to give people the address on my video. We can't move forward discussion. So, and you folks have been doing a great job. Let's just carry that on.
But yeah, what I was going to say is just taking his word for how much the city improved, I think that can also sort of be an indicator for how much development can happen in a short period of time if a city really makes it a priority. So yeah, that was all I wanted to say. Oh, okay, that's fine. Yeah.
You're going to need one for you. We need both.
Yep.
Both of them need.
Yes, we do.
Did you have more? I see you were sort of making a more extensive point.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think it's good. I think I said everything I wanted to say.
Well, one bigger point that's especially more explicit in countries where they have a ministry of culture and they have a ministry of planning, and we saw, and then sometimes they have strong leaders, and so we saw that in the discussion of Pulsar. So Paris is arguably one of the most planned cities, the whole city, and the feel that I trained for a marathon. I ran a marathon in Paris while I was teaching there. And as I trained every other night, I was training all over running different neighborhoods all around Paris. And the whole city has that sense. Not just where the tour buses take you, the Louvre and so forth. But the second part, I saw that even more in Grenoble, which is sort of the Silicon Valley of France, where you had planners and high-tech engineers, and they generally had a strong planning orientation, which I would see visibly with talking with many people who were in I knew people were visiting there for a year. I knew people who had been students there. This goes back for 50 years and so forth. And then there were the big point is planning is a big, salient, visible thing in France for a long time. And as I talked about a couple of sessions back, the most important visible were two people, let's say, beginning and then closer to present. Francis, the name of France, Francis the First, and Charles de Gaulle, G-A-U-L-L-E, the old word for the French. So in their names, they had a sense of national pride, identity, and also somewhat of a vision a vision which somehow was some of us, a scene. Okay, so the scene was there in a semi-explicit manner, talking about planning and so pretty clearly, perhaps the most dramatic in terms of tearing down streets and doing things was Haussmann. I mean, Haussmann, is the planner, organizer, administrator under the political top people. He was, in a sense, the chief of staff of rebuilding the whole city. I guess that the analogs we have in cities that were bombed to death, almost, in World War II. Vienna, Berlin, parts of London, Portsmouth, which was the naval military city of England, was completely flattened by the Germans early on. And say smaller places like the Netherlands, The Hague was the national capital, heavily bombed. Amsterdam was the shipping headquarters. Rotterdam. Amsterdam was the capital in terms of finance, entertainment, culture, and so forth. That is, I knew a guy. He lived with our family. His name Peter Bakker Schutt, B-A-K-K-E-R, one C, one K. So his father was the chief planner of The Hague, and he names the streets after his children. So Peter had one street. I dated another sister of her when she was a student in Paris and so forth. But my point is, these people had a vision and a sense of having the power, the authority, the official doing this by government and more specifically by planners. You have variations of this, I'd say weaker and more, I would say not that much weaker in many respects. The Japanese emperor, and in the late 19th century onward, and then they had there's a show right now, as I mentioned, the Smart Art Institute here at the University of Chicago. Try to visit it. It's an amazing show. It's called Magi, or Modern Magi, or Magi Modern, and it shows the interpenetration of power in a military, physical, artistic, aesthetic sense of putting them all together. And they said, we will build a new Japan, making it new and modern, and taking whatever we want from the entire rest of the world, because we're no longer being isolated as we were in Asia for earlier centuries. And they sent out emissaries to England, to France, to Germany, to the U.S. and said, what will we bring back that we want to have and to include inside Japan? And the big difference between, let's say, the U.S. is the most extreme, except for the South, the American South. You had guys called samurai, so S-A-M-A-U-A-R-I. These were the military. They were Roman. They were like the Roman soldiers. But they were also unlike the Roman soldiers. They were a quasi caste or class of people over many generations who carried a sword on their side, to even to the degree, if you have people visiting in Japan now, they drive on the quote, wrong side of the road. That is, it's the same as in England. Why did Japan and England, I think in India, drive on that? I think they switched it in India, but basically, why did the Japanese drive on the wrong side of the road? A trivia question, maybe not so trivia. Because when the swordsmen would pull out their swords, they didn't want to chop off any heads while they were going the other way. They had to get their swords out, you know, if they needed them. But the people who built the road said, you know, we're going to have people, you know, getting, you know, people who are just little merchants or people going to shop or farmers. They shouldn't be chopped up by somebody's sword. And where it's said that basically they said, all right, we'll let the people, we'll always have the on their horse, probably, or walking. If they've got a sword there on both sides, let's do that lift out that sword so that it's not in the same way, except in the direction of oncoming traffic. Okay. That importance, that visible importance of the sword, of the samurai, led to the introduction of lots of Japanese culture in ways that would pacify the samurai. A visible manner of this in terms of linking this down to urban innovation, we think of the Japanese variation of the hosmans. The Japanese, and this was this was noticed in many places. For example, Madame Butterfly, famous opera by Puccini. What's the sword? Well, that's one story. Just another one, same story almost. It's on. The end of the Vietnam War, and the lady who had an American military boyfriend who was to marry her, and who went back to his wife in America and left the child. This was a big Broadway show, and it was written by, I think, two Frenchmen carrying the Indo-Chinese War. But the one which gave the name, which is also part of the movement more generally, it's called La Bohème, and La Bohème in French was used because it came from Paris to Italy, and so Puccini then presented the alien foreigners, where it was the captain of an American ship, but should have taken place sometime in the mid-19th century, several years before Puccini wrote this. But he then, after having an affair, left Japan with a son on the way, and so the tragedy of the mother left by an American military invader was in both cases the villain. Okay, so the villain in the arts was given an artistic, emotional kind of image, which in a sense challenged the samurai of the Japanese. So how could the Japanese come back in this sense of having this so roughly at that time, Puccini must have composed, maybe we could check, want to check a date somebody, of La Bohème, came out about the same time that the Japanese were saying, we have to confront these Europeans, not just the Americans, the Germans, the French, the English. All these people are doing, I mean, they're trading. We've been trading with them for a couple of 100 years. We've been making pottery and so forth as are the Chinese.
How do you spell it?
La Bohème in French.
Okay.
Boheme.
Got the H.
And
Those tricky H's.
Boheme. Puccini is the composer.
It was composed between 1893 and 1895.
Okay, 1893 to 95 it's almost exactly when the Japanese were sending their emissaries. I never thought of this until right now, but the dates match so perfectly. I want to just to get part of what but linking this is to the ideas, that is, the ideas in people's heads about how do we interpret these, quote, events. So I went to a meeting organized by our Fawi Scenes collaborator, chief guy in Japan, it's Yoshiaki Kobayashi. He was the local, meaning the national Japanese organizer of the International Political Science Association. And it was in Fukuoka, far southern city, but also an active, it's very nearby Korea, and of trading and high tech. In a sense, it's arguably a sort of Silicon Valley version. So we have Grenoble, Silicon Valley, Fukuoka, and their counterparts in India, of highly high tech, planning-oriented cities. One of the sessions I went to in Fukuoka was organized probably by Kobayashi. At that point, a Columbia University professor, Donald Keene, K-E-A-N-E, Donald Keene, professor of literature. He has single-handedly, basically, translated. I have a shelf of books like this, and 80% were translated by Donald Keene, major works of literature from Japan over 500 years. He then has an introduction about these, and I've been reading these for 5 to 10 years, and I would read this stuff by Donald Keene and say, wow, this is really an interesting interpretation. And that he had a sociological sense of how these would fit together, although he had no sociological training. But so I went to a session where he was the commentator. The main panelists were Japanese historians, mainly. Maybe they're political science, but mainly they're experts on this period. The Meiji period now that is, the Meiji period was being constructed in the minds and the planners, the leaders of Japan, at the same time that the Labuan came out. In a sense, that was a cultural, visible example of the challenge from an Italian opera perspective, but the Japanese, I would say, took it as a foreign outsider, challenging its national identity in some respects. So what could they come back? They went to Europe. They didn't just say, we're going to follow the English or we're going to follow the Germans. They changed it right from the beginning. And so the dramatic thing which they did was not to have, say, General Electric or General Motors or Krupp, a German steel building company. They created what they called trading companies. So the trading companies, today we have names like Honda, Toyota, Sony, Mitsubishi. These are not just doing one industry, in that sense, by American corporate standards. We don't have this in America to speak of. The closest thing, in a sense, is Amazon, or something which is very broader and bigger, more ambitious than the Americans have done, or the English have done, which are much more narrow. It was planned for sure, and it was a plan for reorganizing the whole economy of the Japanese economy and the life of the people who would live within these trading companies. Similarly, in a sense, it was a holism. That is the idea of not having, so in terms of the political battles at the time, we had the more, let's call civilian, we have the emperor, we have the samurai, we have then business people in terms of industry. We have then farmers, peasants, others, and fishermen, lots of fishermen, okay. Traders, etc. The big difference from Europe or the US was the samurai. They were often the top leaders, at least officially, and I don't know, and I haven't, but they were being discussed by these five people, big people in this panel. They were trying to go into the minds, go into the details, the archives of how these trading companies and how the whole samurai transformation took place. But basically, the samurai were the official leaders, but the people down one or two levels down may well have been engineers, civil servants, other people who I'll give you one example I've mentioned before. You go to if you go probably today, I haven't done it yesterday, I would say recently, if you go to the top pastry area, top pastry shop in Tokyo, and I mean, I've lived in Paris for years, I go to the top pastry shop in Tokyo, and it's as good as the very best in Paris. They can take the best from Paris and do it better, and then they present it in a new way. Instead of having maybe, I don't know the business of pastry in Tokyo, but if it were like the automobiles, Sony, microchips, these other things, and I'm wearing some pants from, I think we talked about the clothes that have been designed and in Japan, but manufactured in China. Uniqlo. Okay, so the Uniqlo designer clothes has a little bit of stretchiness, which the Italians would never do. The Italians use cotton and wool, period. The Japanese, they've got the fanciest kinds of material that are, they're light years ahead of the Italians in terms of how you do this. And then to get the designers, they get people from Italy, they get others, they work together, et cetera, et cetera. So my simple point, they would bring in, but they would change it right from the beginning and make it work in a way that would fit with Japan. First, with an essentially called the power structure of the samurai in this context of the emperor, but then involved there were who else was doing what, and this is why a visit to the Smart Art Gallery and looking at the catalog. It's a history of early 20th century Japan, culture, social, and it's in the paintings. So the emperor would dress in Western clothes, and he needed a cane. A cane they did not Japan use. They brought in a cane from Western. And then other people said, "Oh, don't show the emperor using a cane, for God's sake, and shouldn't show this Western clothes." So some did and some did not. So these kinds of things are discussed in cultural cinematic detail, at the same time as aesthetics being front and foremost. But at the same time, these were then seriously discussed. This was a, as you well know, we have a senior experienced Korean who lived under Japanese rule from roughly the period of the Meiji up until the end of the Korean War. And so, let me back up. So MacArthur and World War II, we should date it with the Korean War is really MacArthur again. So MacArthur made two big splashes. I can't resist but telling one Chicago and into the story. Why are there 2 Koreas today? And how did they get? So we have some Chinese sitting at the table, and we have a Korean. Now we can ask the expert. Can you tell us why we have 2 Koreas today?
2 Koreas?
Two Koreas, North Korea and South Korea.
Yeah, because of the what politics that time in 1940s. The North part was invaded by the Russians, like communist parties, and South part was quite ruled by the Americans, liberal parties. So there were some.
Why wasn't it 1/3 or 1/3 either further north or further south? Why was it right by Incheon and then going from Incheon right across to the ocean across all of Korea? That is, at that point, the war was on. Some of the Southerners invaded and started to go north, and the people in the north had a few discussions with people in China, and the Chinese got seriously involved. And pretty rapidly, the Chinese and North Koreans pushed very far south, through most of South Korea was occupied by North Korean and Chinese troops. The Americans were barely visible at all. The South Koreans were seen as losing. So, who was in charge from a military American standpoint? His name was Douglas MacArthur, who was known. He'd also, I think, at that point, before or during, that is, he was ready to run against Dwight David Eisenhower to be president of the U.S. Eisenhower was elected because he was so successful in Europe. He was the European commander of the American armies. The Asian commander was the Asian leader. And so he wrote to Roosevelt had died. Truman was a nonentity in many respects, but he was in charge of in the mind of Douglas MacArthur. He was, Superman hero in his mind for sure. And so he wrote to the chief of staff of the military and to the president and said, "We are losing this war to the Chinese. We must act immediately, and we must be very active and successful, and we can't just take on man against man. We must basically, at least how much we don't know what he said, but basically to go from Incheon all the way across, to cut off the Chinese troops in half of Korea in the middle of the war." And so what did the chief of staff and the president of the United States say? "No, you can't do that. That's much too risky. You'll get Americans killed. Lots of people will be killed. It's too dangerous." And so what did Douglas MacArthur do? He did the opposite. He ignored the president. He ignored the chief of staff of all the generals. And he did what he wanted to do. Damn. So he went right across Korea. He chopped off the whole Chinese army to the south. And so then they said, let's get back to the north. And so they basically stopped at that line. So in that sense, we have this military geographic kind of, and so thereafter, clearly we have the communist domination in the north and the alternatives in the south. But is it one clear southern style? One thing which you do have, well, what they had I gave one example. I gave 5 lectures in Seoul, and I was there for 2 weeks. Before I went there, I was in Korea, in Tokyo, and I talked with them, and I said, I'm going to go to Korea. I don't want to talk about We talk about scenes, things like that in Korea, and ask them where and how does this work in Korea. And so say what's something that I can take that would contrast Korea and Japan. So that I won't mention a name, but a major Japanese advisor suggested take a scene of, and he had it ready. He sent it to me, so I looked at it. So I showed it at a Korean at 5 different. Gosh, I shouldn't tell you, but I used it more than once. As soon as I began to show this, it was a picture of maybe 200, 300 people waving little Japanese flags. They were cheering the Emperor of Japan. Okay, what as a Korean, have you ever seen this in Korea?
That kind of scene.
A honorific, charismatic scene with the Emperor waving, with people among citizens waving Japanese flags.
Yeah, I think Japanese have.
Now, have you ever, now a simple question: have you ever seen that image or a video in Korea?
I've seen it.
Where?
I don't remember exactly, but somewhere.
Okay.
Maybe in
No.
history.
But the reason I ask is, it is illegal inside Korea to show that picture. And so each time I started to show this video, people say, you can't show that in Korea. This is illegal. Stop. Stop the video. Okay. The point is, many products were illegal. Well, I'm using a deviant case to illustrate the strong background. Korea was, beaten down militarily and occupied by the Japanese through the first half of the 20th century. The Koreans, and were in that sense felt that they had been dishonored, and the Koreans in turn have I won't go into too much in terms of history, but I'm trying to give you a sense that all three, just one sense. The Koreans have a literature on this, and the Koreans basically fought many wars with the Mongolians, the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Koreans almost always lost because they're a small country. China's huge. All the culture, all the history, all the background, it all comes from China. They're all ethnically, they all come from China. Basically, all of the same basic ethnic, large. In terms of far enough back, it's culturally homogeneous. But then within them, especially Korea and Japan, they want to be different. They want to show we are not just Chinese. We have to develop a Korean culture and a Japanese culture. And how can they do it? So the samurai, the Meiji show in the early 20th century, they wanted to have something which is specifically indifferent, but it is, and I'm mentioning this point, is it's shared between Japan and Korea to some degree, but not as much so for China. I mean, China is much more big, and China is more complicated and diversified. I'm sure there's something like the trading companies, but they're also very, it's also a context with Mao there of a strong state and a strong Communist Party, which is different. But I'm mentioning in passing, I'm illustrating the big and the little, the arts and the economy, military and the educational, the political leaders and the average folks, the samurai and the women who are left by a military invader with a quote illegitimate son, and the tragedy that her life was left for the rest of her life. These are big international themes which are partially national, but they also have counterparts, most visibly, written by the two Frenchmen about, what's it called? It's Saigon is the name. It's a Broadway production. Was it maybe is the title Saigon? You know, folks don't know. The musical, it was a musical comedy. Not a comedy, musical tragedy. But Miss Saigon, that's it, Miss Saigon. So Miss Saigon was performed by a singer who was the most charismatic star who was Filipino. She's a Filipino singer, she's a fantastic singer, and I think there's probably a movie, there's probably a YouTube movie of this stuff now as well. but the irony of having the French, two Frenchmen write this, or having, and then Puccini was an Italian, where opera is half of, lots of life there. Took the French name of the term bohème as he could see, a new lifestyle which has taken off in the 21st century. Remember, it's really after 68, with the student revolts after 68, the counterculture had exploded. Okay, so I'm giving you, in a sense, these foundational pieces, and some of these people, some of them were real planners in the sense of Haussmann, but the general point I'm making here is many of the cases, think of Douglas MacArthur, the planners don't get followed, and so often we have a more eclectic. There's a book by a sociologist, Shmuel Eisenstadt, called, I think it's called Japanese Culture. And it basically shows how the Japanese took these magi leadership perspectives in institutions such as trading companies and more and more and more. Over the 20th century, they changed them again and again and again. They tweaked them. They made them. They would fit better with the Japanese uses and lifestyle, and change the rules in various ways. The 400 pages of how they did that. But one more dramatic, symbolic thing to keep in at the end of Miss Saigon, the last American troops are sort of getting onto helicopters at the same time that the troops were arriving and shooting, practically with machine guns, etc. So they basically, that is, Americans have a general style of the military can lead us to success, and this is Putnam. And Putnam's arguments, Susan's Theta Scotchball, political science, sociologist at Harvard, they both have big theories, and they're both dead wrong. That is, they say World War I is the source of the New Deal and of Roosevelt and etc. And the war gave us civic activities, and the civic activities have begun really in the 1890s. This is Putnam and Scotchball. This is why, so the theory behind Putnam, of course, was Tocqueville. And Tocqueville's core element of the driver was the civic activity. Civic being either church or also people who would chop up logs and farmers would divide up the territory, etc. So, the theory of is abstract. I'm trying to give you a concrete example, and I gave you, in a sense, French pastry. Take Korea. When the Japanese became the military leaders of Korea, they tore down the emperor's palace, the most sacred kind of quasi-sacred symbolic institution, the emperor's own palace. And inside Japan, I don't know, but I sense it's never been touched for hundreds of years. And everything about the emperor is still treated as so sacred. In Korea, when those Japanese troops were there, they tore down the emperor's palace and they replaced it the crude, simple, modern building, which was the Japanese military headquarters. Small kind of thing. But and so then, after 1945, when the Koreans came back to their own country, the Japanese had gone, what did the Koreans do? They tore down the Japanese military building, and they brought back, they reconstructed in as much detail as exactly they could the Korean Emperor's palace, which had been there for hundreds of years before. And then inside, next to there is a museum. Visit the museum. So I think it's probably the City of Seoul, maybe it's a Korean History Museum. But one of the first things you walk into and you see is a table about as big as these 3 or 4 tables put together, and you see both the Japanese military headquarters and the Emperor's palace. So basically, you're saying, this was our culture. The Japanese destroyed us, and we in turn, and then so I gave you the example. I asked you the question, but the Koreans in turn said it was illegal to import anything from Japan of the following sorts, and many mix of cars, television, electronics, all kinds of things. Nobody in Korea would buy these from Japan. And so I mentioned that in contrast to the relationships between China and the West in the late 20th century. China has been hugely successful in ways that Japan did not afterward in terms of these kinds of differences. So a more general point I'm building on with Oklahoma is to say the book on Japanese culture, transforming those things that came from the West, is what we sometimes have called a private-public partnership. That is, planners may make a beautiful, clean, tight plan, but in fact, in implementation, and even with Hostman, Hostman still would find ideas, and he would change them around as they'd find a better way that they could do that. We're fine.
You can go for like 10 more minutes.
It's an hour off. What time do we take our break?
Typically between like 4:50 and 5.
So 10 minutes. Okay. So I have to. I'm giving you examples of where and how the foundations, but not everything. The big themes of planners, of many smart planners, are not to show the final design of every street and every appearance, but somehow to have the building blocks being there and have some degree of adapting this. And where and how that has happened, this is where I have learned from your discussions and would be glad to see more, for instance, with Shanghai. Where and how Shanghai, Chengdu is the topic of the book for me, which is coming out. Okay, so the 1 or 2 big points are, some people have seen, for instance, I've directed people doing 2 PhDs at Princeton and it was here, basically, on the Chinese conception of historic authenticity, or sort of, I think that's the term that they use, and that's one of our 15 C's dimensions. What is authenticity? A Western conception of authenticity, European and American, tends to be those bricks, that building is authentic. And if you tear down those bricks and you don't have the same bricks, You can't rebuild the Emperor's Palace. You can make it look the same, but it didn't have the same bricks. Okay, so I didn't know about this at all, but in these two theses, they basically did this along at the same time that Beijing was creating the Olympic Games. And to celebrate the Olympic Games in Beijing, they wanted to innovate and make it more dramatic than anywhere else ever, and they did with a vengeance, with an unbelievable. And so in a sense, they almost had a grandson of Haussmann. Well, I'm exaggerating. I shouldn't have said that at all because they didn't go that far. But they did. They tore down the buildings lived in by something like 80,000 people. I mean, imagine 80,000 people. I mean, this is a lot more than Hyde Park. Now, all of Hyde Park, but spread around major parts of right in the middle of Beijing. They tore down the traditional buildings that were there, and they then did a international competition among architects and planners, especially architects. I would say probably more than planners. I mean, the mayors and the people on his staff probably were doing the planning and stuff. And you may know more about that as you're looking at this. But the international planning conferences, and this infuriated the Chinese architects because the Chinese wanted to say, we have a Chinese conception of authenticity within traditions that have been there of houses, little houses, big houses, celebrations, theaters, and so forth. These foreign architects had no idea at all. They came from Italy, they came from England, they came from Norway, they came from the U.S., and so forth. And their foreign plans were built, and they're there today. And so Beijing and these visible, dramatic architectural structures and powerful scenes, which they are, in a sense, were like, so I won't say anything. But Beijing was and is a major city, but to have it, as a multiple centuries old city, to have, giving such a dramatic facelift for the Olympics, and then there's a video. Well, maybe I don't know, we may not have time. Basically, it shows the speech of the president and the hundreds of drummers, all in unison and all in ceremony, bowing and drumming with a discipline, dramatic timing and coordination that looked as if it was one person. And so, it was a very powerful symbolism of uniting all of China and all of the world through that kind of symbolism, but then having the architecture which is there. And Jane Jacobs in the background, we can hear her, remember Haussmann and Jane Jacobs over there. If Jane Jacobs were there, she would have said, all you did was build parking lots. You've got these icons, huge architectural icons. People talk about this structure, different names for this because they were such celebration of architecture. But how do you get there? And so if you walk, that would be fine. If you walk, you've got hundreds of feet before you get from a sidewalk or a street or a bus line to get to the building. So from the standpoint of the pedestrian, the sidewalk life that Jane Jacobs was talking about, there's no place for people to be there. So you got to look at these buildings and say, wow. But okay, so I'm giving you in a sense, and so I'm mentioning this in part because the Europeans and the Americans, the Canadians are now battling. We've got the Jane Jacobs followers, we've got the Getty followers, we've got the et cetera, and so these, in a sense, are competing images of the good or the bad seen. And so, especially having seen these, especially the two dissertations on Beijing for the Olympics, and then and I think that the Chinese have transformed in the meantime, in the succeeding years, many of the Chinese have incorporated what, at least in those two theses, one of which was by a woman who I think was Chinese herself, but she did a PhD at Princeton. She now teaches at UIC. And I've been working with her for 10 years on these things in Chicago. The simple bottom line takeaway I'm trying to make behind the line a lot of this is we see it in Beijing, we see it that is, I'm mentioning Jane Jacobs in the parking lots to say there are different conceptions fighting with each other, and that these are now, I won't say a model, but these are themes of eclecticism in a sense, in Korea, in Japan, in the US, in Paris. That is, we have fast food now, we have fast food shops all over Paris and all over Rome, even though the French still are, hate this kind of stuff. So, many French. The slow food movement of Rome and Paris is still killing us Americans, can't have terrible food. And it's with German names, Hamburger and Frankfurt, which came from across the German border. Okay. So the point, the bigger point I'm trying to get to is you and we need to understand cities, to understand aesthetics, to understand where and how a city planner or mayor or architect or advisor and consultant of these, or if you're writing a book as a professor, how to do this. You can't just have one plan totally integrated and to have it imposed and have everybody say, oh yes. Even in Beijing, the president of the country got criticized by the Chinese architects. And so what we need, and so I'm not saying that any of these is right or wrong. I'm making the point that you're only right if you have a simplified story, such as, for instance, the American version of that was President Jefferson. The Jeffersonian conception of democracy was everything is bottom up, and Tocqueville took some of that away. That is, you had everything was individual farmers, and so the city was immoral, bad, and un-American, and therefore that conception of the right and the wrong had an aesthetic, political philosophy, ideological, political party program, etc. And it still is an element there that you can find within the U.S. with cowboys, with Ronald Reagan. Trump tries to pick up on it and so forth. And the Wild West being linked with the yeoman farmer of Virginia or Massachusetts. Okay, so the point I'm making is the way you can understand these kinds of conflicts today is not to try to say that anybody is right or wrong, because everybody is eclectic to some degree. But I had that, I talked to you for 10 minutes about the samurai, simply to say the samurai have a hand and a visible hand that they were there, the trading companies were to give them a visible official position, which made them be, since the military industrial complex. But at the same time, they didn't really do it. There were other people who were, so. But the book with Megan Kelman, which was, I didn't really talk about it, but we talked about the youth in Beijing. So if we gave them, we gave them almost the whole first half and really continued the second half. All of last week was really on Beijing youth. But what we left out was the third sector. And the point is, one of the simple points of that book is The Asian conception of civic activity was people who would work under the state. And so if you would be a doctor, that is, there is no Doctors Without Borders in China. That's a French organization, and it challenges the state. By contrast, in Asia, if they were to come from abroad, or especially abroad, but also if they were Japanese being a volunteer, whether they were in Japan, or Japanese going to China, etc. The state model still was the Asian model for the 20th century, in ways that the American model was the opposite. It was private capital and private entrepreneurship, private hospitals, private professions, doctors. This is an MD, a Korean MD, as well as studying IR and other things. As the world, and as we have an explosion through social media of egalitarianism, marked and dramatically by Mao, the Little Red Book, really, brought more egalitarianism, which was not there celebrated by the European socialists. That's too strong a statement, in a sense. The point I'm making is the communist parties of Europe were very tough, were very ideologically pure in the sense. And the leaders were the ideological leaders. Trotsky, Lenin, Stalin. And they didn't think or talk that much about egalitarian. So in that sense, that is explicitly they didn't talk about. Okay, so I won't go to subjects, but the egalitarianism has become much more important in the whole world. Two visible, symbolic, simple things are just we've had an explosion of education. Universities. University students, as C. Wright Mills said, are the new proletariat. You are the leaders, and so as I came in today, I was 5 more minutes late because I had to take a little video of the encampment. Okay, so that's the University of Chicago. So we're a week or two after Harvard and Stanford and Columbia, but by God, here it is. Now, here it is. Let me be careful. I was here in 1969, and you know what happened in 1969, which was analogous to that? The Vietnam War, yes, that was going on. 69. 69, it was winding down pretty much, but basically, right on this campus, these two buildings. This is the Cobb Hall. What's the name of the next building to the north? The administration building, the Edward Levy administration building. Who was president at the time? Edward Levy. He was provost and then he became president. Okay. What did the students, my sister was a first-year student in the college. She studied, her father had been, my father was teaching in Grenoble, was to have a sabbatical in Grenoble. When 68 took place in France, she knew all about 68 in Paris. She was a lycée student. She was graduating from, so she was surrounded by all these French kids. Down with de Gaulle, we're going to have a revolution, we're going to bring in counterculture, and they did. And it worked in a sense. So this year she was at the University of Chicago, first year freshman. And so what did the students do here? There are many young ladies who had no interest or knowledge in politics or how to do this sort of stuff in practice. And there were a couple of guys who were both from New York. They had both been Columbia students, Columbia University BA students. And then I got to know them here because they were both PhD students in sociology at the University of Chicago, and I got to know them well. Okay, they knew about that. They were very sophisticated compared to the young girls like my sister, and those two guys never used any violence personally, and never. But they got the young girls and said, and I know there's some boys as well. and they said, let's take over the administration building. And what did that mean? They did. They went into that building just north of us, and they occupied. So if we talk about the term occupy, okay, the visitors here, we have, that is, I took the picture because the video, because it's quiet out there. You don't hear any taunting, any speaking. Why is it so? For when my sister was there, okay, unlike Harvard, unlike Stanford, unlike Berkeley, unlike Kenya and so forth, what happened in Cambridge or Berkeley when they had when they had students who were active demonstrators like that? What did they do, and what have they done in the last two months in Cambridge and in the university and in Columbia and Harvard, two visible places right now. Certainly on the New York Times. What's happening? They fired the president of Harvard. But the predecessor said, well, so she called the police. She's become isolated, violence, having the police come in. I mean, it created terrible conflict between the faculty and the administration at Harvard. Same thing is going on basically later happened at Columbia. University of Chicago, we had many meetings. I just arrived here myself the year before, I guess. And we went to meeting after meeting, and the faculty were divided. And at that point, it was a different university, but in the sense that it was clearly a faculty research-dominated university, and Edward Levy was part of it, and he was very close to Edward Shills, who was an active participant in all of this. He wrote the books, and Edward Levy, close friend, etc. But basically, the administration building was occupied. Faculty were divided. Levy as well agreed and thought and acted with most of the faculty who said, we never want to call the police. What can we do? He's a lawyer. He's a professor of law school. We can use the law, and they can apply to individuals. And so we will not call any police. We'll just wait. And after about a month, the students got tired of being surrounded by. So some of them were there a lot. Many of them, my sister, she went in and out a little bit, but was not there all the time. But some students were there all the time. They occupied the administration building, but there was no effort to use force. And so this is why I said Hong Kong showed the confidence of the Chinese leadership that we can let those students occupy, and we don't. And they did not call in the police in Hong Kong for a long time, a lot more than in Chicago. I don't know how many months it was, 6 months or something like that. But there was a letter that came out from the president here 2 days ago. We may have. Are we in? What is the position of this university in terms of having this kind of tent or whatever encampment? And what could have been written by Edward Shills or Edward Levy in terms of that first paragraph? We are not in favor or against these kinds of activities as long as and he may not have used the term value, but said our value is to advance knowledge and to help this knowledge be accumulated by faculty and by students. And if they can do that job of learning more and participating in the advancement of our knowledge-based activities, there should be no problem for people who were in the tent. I mean, I didn't get his words exactly there, and I'm giving it to you because it wasn't invented by him. He's exactly giving you a carbon copy of what was done in 1969, and which was totally different from every other major American or minor American university or college. Nobody else did that. Okay, and so the students there know that, and he said, so he then has 2 cases of what happened earlier by his administration here in the last year or so. that, you know, if you do bad things, you will potentially will call the police, you know, if you're really violent, but you're going to be viewed and you will be considered one person each at a time, and we will ask you to participate. What you have done when you were, if you did things in the tent, and if you, and people like my sister just wanted to learn about this. She didn't want to do any damage. She didn't want to have any violence, and she went before the hearing, and she was not expelled. A couple of guys were expelled. Some people were suspended for 3 months or 6 months or for a year, but each person got a different trial with a different sanction, which might have been imposed based on what the individual had done and said. Okay, so that legalistic solution is what is now being followed, but which is uniquely Chicago in that sense. And it seems, who knows what's going to happen. So far, I mean, just looking at it, it wasn't. This is a lot more quiet than it was in 1969. Yeah.
I think this is an interesting conversation. I have some questions, but maybe we'll get back to it after we come back from the break. All right.
Time for food.